Welcome, Darryl. I'm really glad to be speaking to you today, man. This has been a long time coming, and I've been wanting to interview you and discuss your book for a while. I'm hoping the people listening to this will really get a lot from it because I got a lot from it so far. And it's a book that you've written called Zero by One. I would like to know, just for people listening, exactly what is Zero by One? What is the theory? I know you don't really necessarily have a name for the theory yet, or as of yet, but perhaps we can find one for it. But right now, the idea of maybe zero theory as a placeholder name, does that agreeable to you? Yeah.
That's what I've been running with.
Okay, good. Zero theory. I like it. Yeah. Would you please give us a resume and overview of what zero theory is all about?
Okay, well, my name is Darryl Langford, and I'm the owner and operator of Zero by One Publishing LLC. And that's just a LLC I set up to promote the book and handle the financing on it. But Zero by One is a book. It's a metaphysical theory of existence. And the reason why it's called Zero by One is one is technically the author. It's zero being authored by one, which is kind of confusing. But it's the story of existence. Existence is the number one in the story, and it's telling its own autobiography from start to finish. If you notice, the book has a big zero on the front and then a one on the back, and then between the two covers, you have the entire story of existence. And it's also available in a 55-page companion document. This is for the people that don't want to deal with any of the hand-wavy bullshit. They just want to go straight to the brass tacks. You can order the companion document and get a condensed version of the theory. And I kind of like the condensed version because I just don't like sitting down reading books. Plus, I have vision trouble. But that's how it's presented. And it was published in 2021 in April, and it's been doing fairly well so far. But it could go a lot farther. But it is a metaphysical theory of existence, and it offers a little bit of predictability in the end because of the way it's structured and the way that it deals with how data evolves over time. So it starts out based on two axioms. The first axiom is that existence must be justified, and the second axiom is that existence is logically necessary. These are the two constraints to existence that it must operate between throughout the entire process of the evolution. So the first axiom, we're going to say existence must be justified. That is a constraint, that is a requirement that anything that exists must be justified in its existence. And the example I give for that is a lawnmower on Mars. If we all lived on Mars, there wouldn't be any grass there. So no Martian's going to invent a lawnmower. The existence of the lawnmower wouldn't be necessary because the relative condition for the existence of the lawnmower doesn't exist. There's no grass. Nobody would even conceive it. And the other axiom is that logic says that existence is logically necessary. And that's a philosophical debate. A lot of people might not agree with that. But existence as a single isolated state and non-existence as a single isolated state are inconceivable. You must have a pair. You must have existence and non-existence. The fact that non-existence has existence in its definition predicates the existence of existence. You can't avoid it. So that since it's logically necessary, I applied a lot of logic to the theory. And my theory is based on things that we know. I don't like to include a lot of wild cards in the theory. I don't like to put in additional universes, additional dimensions, gods, anything like that. Things that you have to add to a theory to make it work, I think, make the theory less believable. So what I did is I took everything in existence that we know, that we're fairly certain. I mean, some people can argue certain points, but we can understand that there's a universe. We can understand that we are born. We can understand that we have consciousness. All of these things that we can observe, I just took them all and made them into puzzle pieces and then applied all the puzzle pieces, assembled them all into what I thought would be a complete picture. And the complete picture is this book. That's how it all comes out. So there are structural parts of the theory, and then there's the theory itself. So I can start with the structure of it. Would you like me to do that first?
Yes. let's start with the structure of the theory so that we kind of have the skeleton and a snapshot overview, and then we can dive into the details.
All right. Well, it's the whole concept is predicated on 5 laws of existence, and these are laws that I made up. So that's you can jump right in on those for the critics and skeptics. But I call them laws. They're my contraption. You can call them rules, regulations, whatever it is. I call it a criteria for existence that anything that's seeking existence must follow. It must abide by. And so I have 5 of these, and these 5 laws are what governs what can exist, how long it can exist, its purpose for existence, and if it can survive existence. And the first law of existence is that existence must be anything seeking existence must be logically conceivable. That's a constraint. And that's right out the door. If something is going to exist, it must be conceivable. And that's a point of contention. A lot of people don't necessarily go along with that. They think that's too human oriented. But they say it's a product of the mind. Conceivability is a mind concept. But I argue that the same minds that are conceiving things are the same minds that are critiquing whether or not something can exist and coming up with all these other theories. So conceivability works just as much as any other mind concept and coming up with a theory. But that's the rule, is it must first be conceivable. And then the second law of existence argues that whatever is conceivable must be able to be actuated. You have to be able to bring it into existence based on its description. The example I give is I used a powdered water machine as my example, but somebody wants to say, well, snow is a powder. But so I had to change it over to a powdered helium machine because you can't take a noble gas and turn it into a powder. The idea was to present a machine that can create something that is impossible to create. And the fact that you cannot turn helium into a powder means that a powdered helium machine cannot exist based on the second law of existence. So because a powdered helium machine can't make it past the second law of existence, its chances for survival are 0. Each stage of the law builds upon the previous one. So the second law builds on the first, and the third law builds on the second. And if you make it all the way to last, you have a sustained point of existence. So something must first be conceivable, then it must be able to be actuated based on its description. That means if you got anything in there that doesn't make sense, it's not going to exist. Then the third law is that you must have, for whatever is seeking existence, must have a counter reference point to offer contrast. There has to be something to offer a distinction between what is seeking existence and the opposite of whatever it is. And that's where you get fundamental dichotomies of existence. You get existence, non-existence, positive, negative, expansion, contraction, repulsion. Everything has an opposite. You have life, death, predator, prey, male, female, good, bad, truth, false. These are all fundamental characteristics of existence. And the reason why you have the opposing condition is because that's what's required to render conceivability for both. And that goes back to the first law of existence. That's what establishes the conceivability. So with existence, you have existence and non-existence. So that is a dichotomy, but that dichotomy has to be recognized in some way. It has to be brought into reality. Just as, for one thing, non-existence is technically inconceivable because there's nothing available for you to conceive. And that presents a paradox that existence must contend with as it moves forward. So the fourth law of existence is a spectrum formation. After you've done the first 3 laws of existence and you've got something you've got something and a counter something, and we can just take quark and an antiquark as an example. If you have a quark and an antiquark, you have your first 3 laws. They're all conceivable. It can be actuated because we know quarks exist. And then you have its counter reference point. So it's conceivable. It's followed all of its requirements. Then when it reaches the fourth law of existence, it must form a spectrum. And the minimal amount of set members you can have in a spectrum is 2, because it's your 2 endpoints on the spectrum. But you're not going to get some kind of middle quark. There is no up quark, down quark, and some middle quark, or between the antiquark and the quark. But there are spectrums that can form where you can get a middle point. Like if you have a hydrogen atom, you have one proton and one electron. So you have your two counter reference points, a positive and negative, but you can include a neutron in the middle of it. Now you can expand that spectrum. So the two types of spectrums that form within the fourth law of existence are dynamic spectrums and closed spectrums. Anything where you can't insert a, a new set member through some kind of evolutionary process, anytime you do that, then it becomes a closed spectrum. And if you can include a set member, if you can expand that spectrum, then you have a dynamic spectrum. And the dynamic spectrums are the ones that existence is interested in. It wants to take two counter reference points and expand that spectrum as far as it can. And the reason why it wants to create all these spectrums and the reason why it goes through all this process is to satisfy the fifth law of existence. And that is the fifth law of existence says existence must be justified. The existence of anything that exists must be justified. And that's a pretty bold philosophical assertion there. But really it's based in logic. It's based on the principle of sufficient reason. That states that any action that you take, there has to be a sufficient reason for you to do it. And it also goes back to my lawnmower reference, where you're not going to build a lawnmower on Mars if there's no grass. So it's not justified to have a lawnmower. So the fact that existence is one small conceivable step above non-existence requires that it seek justification for being that one step above non-existence. There has to be a reason for it to not be non-existent. And that's the struggle that goes on between those two axioms that I mentioned earlier. Existence is logically necessary, but it also must be justified. So the entire struggle of existence is trying to satisfy those two criterion. So moving forward from there, that's the structure. That's the, I guess, the game rules for existence. That's what it must, like if football has its rules, existence has its rules. It must abide by those rules. So there's an evolutionary process that I posit happens in the book, and that's where existence moves from simplicity to complexity through all stages of evolution. Now, people who are fans of biological evolution want to argue, say, well, evolution isn't one way. You can go either way. And that might be, but I consider it more like the New York Stock Exchange. You can have stocks that go up and down and companies that go away, and new companies that emerge. But if you look at the stock chart for the New York Stock Exchange from its beginning all the way up to now, it's an uphill climb. It's constantly moving upward. And existence moves the same way. Every stage of existence starts out with minimal complexity and then works its way up to higher complexity. So if that structure can be documented and you can observe it, then you can find a picture of existence, a pattern. You can find these patterns and draw a complete picture of how it all operates. So I have what I call recursions. You have 5 laws of existence, and then I have 6 different recursions embedded into the theory that how existence facilitates itself and keeps pushing into higher complexity. So the recursions, to explain them, would be probably I could use a mini series or something like or Happy Days. I don't know. Are you familiar with Happy Days, the TV show?
I am familiar with it, yeah.
All right, it's an old show. But you've got these high school students that go to high school and they write a whole storyline behind that. But sooner or later, they're going to get out of high school and have to go to college. And after a while, you just run out of information to work with. You keep retracing the same things over and over. And then they have their main character, what they call jumping the shark. And that's where you create some exciting scene to try to get people interested in it again. And so Happy Day starts out, everybody's interested in it, but over time, you lose interest in it because it becomes redundant information and you want to find something new. Another example would be the game Asteroids from the 80s. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes. I've never
Actually,
played this or watched that
the
show.
little arcade games from the 80s. I actually went for a world record on one of them, but I didn't make it. But Asteroids, you had a 2-dimensional screen and you had a little triangle. It was called the SS triangle, and there would be asteroids that would come at you and you would shoot them. But it's all line drawing. It's all 2-dimensional white outlines, and you would shoot these asteroids, score points, and little spaceships will come out and try to kill you. But after a while, when it's new, when you're working on it, you learn strategies and plans. But as time goes on, you start to see a pattern that you're not going to get any more information out of this machine. It's just the same thing over and over and over. And the people who designed it knew that same problem. They recognized that, so they created Asteroids 3D. They took the same concept and upscaled it into a 3D form. It's no longer a two-dimensional plane, it's a three-dimensional plane. Now these rocks that are coming at you are a lot more difficult to destroy. But the upgrade in the technology was a necessity of it not producing any new information. You get bored with it. So each of these recursions that I'm going to explain, they show a pattern of evolution particularly associated with a certain domain of existence. And I don't want to get technical. I hate it when people use technical terms and don't define them. But a domain is just an area of existence where there's a start and an end. I don't necessarily want to say an end, but a point where it goes to the next recursion. And the best example I could give would be life. Life is one of the recursions. In fact, it's the third recursion. There's been 6 of them that have happened in existence according to my theory. And the third recursion would be the emergence of life. So before 4 billion years ago, we know there was no life. At least we know that for planet Earth. That's the year we assign life being emerging on planet Earth in the form of prokaryotes. Before that, we just assumed that it was an inanimate universe. We don't have any other examples of life happening. So somewhere along the line, there was a domain change from inanimate to animated. And that's when you get your first prokaryotes. And necessarily, your first prokaryote starts out, it's the most simplistic representation of life. It's a acellular, single-celled bacteria, has a nucleoid and an outer shell, it's indicative of life and death. That's your dichotomy that initiates that recursion. So it starts out with life and death, and consequently, that is a closed spectrum because you don't have anything that you can put in between life and death. Life is just life, and death is death. There is no half live, half dead. So what existence does is it takes the one that you can do something with and it starts doing something with it. So it starts expanding the complexity of prokaryotes through evolution, through biological evolution. It keeps pushing forward, trying to increase in complexity. And so you take a 4 billion year timeline and you start out with prokaryotes. 4 billion years later, you have self-aware humans with what science calls the most complex structure in the universe, a human brain encased inside it. So it went from minimal complexity to the highest complexity that we know of today. We don't know of anything more complex than the human brain. We're probably approaching it with AI, but that's all we know right now. So that's your structure of the third recursion. There was a point in, I guess, roughly 10 billion years from the beginning of the universe that existence decided, I'm not getting any more information out of this system. I'm going to upgrade to a new system. So it initiates life. And in that life, that you had that 4 billion year evolution. And now here we are discussing this theory on your podcast. That's the way complexity works. So that's where I want to start to describe how the system works, how the theory unfolds. And this is kind of pulling a page from unity theory, because when you all were discussing unity theory, you said you can't take one end of the timeline or the beginning or the end. It's best to start in the middle because you have information in the past that you can use along with information beyond that point, and you could piece them together to create a complete picture. So starting at the third recursion is obviously it's in the middle if you got 6 of them. So the third recursion is how I explained it. So if we go back one recursion, the recursion that facilitated the third recursion would be the second recursion. And the second recursion follows the same pattern as the third. If you look at the universe 10 billion years ago, or you can look at it now, it's essentially not that much different. But if you look at the universe right now, you have the highest degree of complexity. You have planets with that could sustain life. You have galaxies, solar systems. The universe is populated with complexity, including humans. But if you go all the way back to the beginning of the universe, the first stable representation of matter was the hydrogen atom. And that's 1 proton and 1 electron. It all consequently is positive and negative. Now, positive and negative is interesting because that's a dynamic spectrum. You can put things in between positive and negative, something called neutral. So it's a dynamic spectrum. And once you establish that, you can start building more structures from that. You can build deuterium if you add a neutron. You can go from hydrogen to deuterium merely by adding a new spectrum member. So when you keep doing that and keep building that complexity, you can end up with 118 elements and a completely new universe chock full of complex structure. So in the second recursion, existence starts out at its most simplest form and that structure, and that's your hydrogen atom with the proton and the electron. Then it expands in complexity until it reaches a point of redundancy or information that's not producing any more novelty. You can only observe so many particle interactions. You can only see so many moons colliding, asteroids hitting things before that information gets redone. It's almost predictable. The existence is happy that it can create more complexity from the hydrogen atom, but it's not finding anything that's going to offer justification for what it's doing. It has to satisfy that fifth law of existence. I mean, it's building its structures. It's conceivable. It's got its dichotomic pairings. All of those things are going on, but there's just nothing going on that establishes justification for any of it happening at all. And that's why it would move into the third recursion, is it wants to find that missing link that justifies existence. But it can't find it with inanimate matter, and that's what precipitates it moving into animated matter. Same reason the asteroids manufacturers move to 3D. You're not getting anything out of that 2D anymore, so you move it into 3D. So if you go one recursion before that, we have the mystery recursion. This would be the most contended part, I guess, of my theory. The first recursion and the sixth recursion are the two key elements of the theory that people are really going to pounce on. They're really going to want to debate. But I propose a recursion that happened before the second recursion, and that would be a transition from non-physical to physical. So we have the physical transition into animated life. So you got inanimate to animated, but you can have something from non-physical to physical. You can conceive that in your mind as something taking place. So I address it. I take structure, the way structure is designed, and I argue that it can be envisioned in a non-physical way just through description, through mathematical description. So it's kind of a proto-universe or a pre-universe, and it would be completely comprised of non-physical information. It's mathematical calculation. It's logic. It's what you get before you get physical matter. So the first recursion, we're going to say, well, let's just call it mathematics for want of a better word. But it's a logical system. It's logic working itself out. It's figuring itself out. What it does is it starts out at its most minimalistic form and then expands in complexity through multiplication, addition, subtraction, division, and all expanded forms of mathematics from there. But you have to have a starting point for that. I've had a starting point for each other recursion. For the universe, it's the hydrogen atom, and for life, it's the prokaryote, and they're both very similar in a way. So I have to find that similar mechanism in the first recursion that facilitates its evolution. And the way that is accomplished is I have to take that non-physical realm all the way down to its most minimalistic point of conceivability. It has to be conceivable to match the first law of existence, but it also has to be the most minimalistic point that you can conceive. So what I do is, this is a philosophical position on this, is that existence at the beginning, I actually have an origin point for existence, which, you say you can't get something from nothing. I think I've found a way to get something from nothing, and that's through recognition of itself. If existence doesn't have a counter reference point, because non-existence is inconceivable, it doesn't really have a counter reference point. It cannot meaningfully say that it exists. It has nothing to compare itself with. It has no frame of reference to verify its own existence. Since non-existence is inconceivable and we can't conceive it because there's nothing available for us to conceive, it has to find a mechanism to render itself conceivable. Existence at the most minimalistic point is not conceivable. It's a static state of nothingness. So what it does is it takes a page from Descartes, where Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. Existence counts itself to determine that it exists. So existence through logic. It's actually an expression of logic, and this is not consciousness like we think about in human terms. This is just intelligence. This is logic and intelligence simultaneously interacting with each other and initiating existence. Existence counts as the amount of existence that's available, and that amount is one. It doesn't know what it is. Existence has no frame of reference. It doesn't know what it is. It has no structure. All it knows is that it is a presence. Existence is a presence, and that presence can be counted as one. There's something there. Now, at the same time, it can count whatever does not represent existence. It can count what's not there. And it can't find anything that's other than itself. That's how it can count it as one. So it counts whatever is not itself as zero. And so what it's doing technically is it's assigning zero to non-existence in order to render it conceivable, to render it comprehensible. It's what I call assigning conceivability via proxy. It's a temporary state of existence so you can figure out what the hell's going on. So once you have 1 and 0 established as a dichotomy, you've satisfied the second law of existence. First, you've created a conceivable scenario now. It can be actuated because now you have a conceivable pairing. You've satisfied the third law of existence, with the non-existence now being a conceivable counterpart to existence. And now you can go on to the fourth recursion and start building spectrums. Can you build a spectrum with 1 and 0? And you can through the operators, through mathematics. You can add, subtract, and generate new information. You start out with the most minimalistic mathematical equations, like you can have 1 plus 1 equals 2. If existence adds itself, it can come up with the number 2, and then it has to decide, well, is it 2 of existence, or is it 1 existence divided into 2? It has all of these logical problems to work out once it can establish itself as existing. So let's just say that it has now created new information, which is the number 2. It can now use that to further expand its complexity. You can have 1 plus 3 and then 3 plus 2. You can just run through the entire litany of mathematical equations trying to find justification for the fact that you're actually making these calculations. It still needs to justify being one tiny step above non-existence. So let's say that it starts out minimalistic with the binary pairing of 1 and 0, and it's exploited every possible mathematical equation on the positive and negative side, but it still has not reached a point of justification for any of that. That's what prompts it to move everything that it's already encountered into the second recursion. It takes all of this non-physical information, all of this exploration of complexity, and moves it into a new domain, a new recursion called the second recursion. And then when the second recursion fails to produce novelty, it fails to produce new information, and it hasn't reached justification for anything it's done, then it moves into the third recursion. And so you can see the pattern that forms there. And the support I offer for it is you do observe the pattern from simplicity to complexity. You are seeing a minimalistic pair in all three situations that evolves into extreme complexity. And the argument that you get bored when you don't find any new novelty and you can't discover any new information, we experience that ourselves. And I'm not saying that our human perspective should in any way influence the way we view a theory, but if we sense the same thing and we are byproducts of the universe, then it is logical that we can apply that to a theory and use that as a pattern, as a template. So in the third recursion, you have life, and that's also consciousness. Consciousness is entangled with life. I don't know I don't think there's any known forms of life, well, animal life that we know of that's void of consciousness. I mean, even prokaryotes, bacteria is selective of the food that it eats, so there's something going on there. But I have consciousness and life being intertwined. But life started out with the prokaryote and expanded all the way up to self-aware humans. And self-aware, you're still seeing the same predator and prey scenarios going on. This animal emerges and eats that animal. This animal has X amount of babies. You keep following this pattern. It's creating new information, but you reach a point of information saturation where you're not producing any novelty. You're just producing more exotic animals. none of them are producing any kind of justification for being one step above non-existence. So you have to up the game. So in the fourth recursion, existence takes all the mechanics of the third recursion, second recursion, and the first recursion, which goes back to 0 and 1, and puts that in the consciousness of self-aware humans. We can think in binary terms. We can think in data processing terms that other animals cannot do. I mean, there are animals that demonstrate the ability to process logic, but as far as mathematics and being able to do the calculations, we're at the top of the food chain in that regard. So by placing the concept, the understanding of 0 and 1 in the minds of humans, existence has taken essentially 8 billion representations of life and thrust the exact same problem it's been facing all along inside of our minds with the idea that we can work it out. Now we are isolated as the observers of the universe. We're the ones that are critiquing everything that's going on. A lot of us have moral judgments about biological evolution. We don't like predator and prey scenarios. We think an animal slaughtering another animal is abhorrent. And I'm kind of that way. I'm not a big fan of predator. When I see videos of animals killing other animals, I find it disturbing. And that's because of our moral framework that comes along with self-awareness. That's that new stage. That's that asteroids 3D thing going on again. We're stepping up the game. We are the final stage of evolution. Existence has taken its essence and put it inside us, separate us from the system, and said, demonstrate justification. Find a way to get there. So it's counting on us to come up with some kind of moral framework. And one of the things that we have done is when you move one system, one domain into another domain, when you move the second recursion into the third recursion, you're taking systems that don't have any sensory perception. They don't have any feelings. They don't know joy or pain. An asteroid that smashes into a planet, there's no remorse there. It's just a function of physics. But when you take these systems and you move it into a living matter, living substance, living animals, pain is a very powerful thing. People who go through suffering many times say, this is ridiculous. This is not worthy of existence. There are people that will say, I have suffered enough that I don't think existence is worthy. They don't want to exist. And that's valuable information. That's new information for existence to work with. It's using us to judge everything that it's done in the past to find flaws in it. It's trying to reconcile moving inanimate systems into animated systems and the consequences that ensue. So through our morality, we are judging existence and critiquing it. And the way we do this is we take morality at its simplest form. I mean, we used to have gladiators fighting in the arena, and now we have football teams throwing passes and all that. It's entertaining. It's still entertaining, but we're not slaughtering each other because we have seen it's not justified to slaughter somebody for entertainment. We're constantly doing that evaluation. So you take that evolution of morality and you push it over time, you end up with a construct called God. And that's where people have taken conceivability to the highest possible level. They've contrived a omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent being, and they've constructed this from our minds. And it is the most complex structure that you can think of. You can't conceive of anything beyond an all-powerful being. That's your upper limit for conceivability. And ironically, I argue that the lower side of conceivability is what science would offer you, which is Big Bang singularity. That's the lowest point of conceivability that we can go, because that takes everything in existence and crams it into a point of singular, a zero-dimensional point. And that's God and the singularity both have conceptual problems because we can't really fully conceive something that is infinite. And if God is infinitely existing, we got a problem there. And if your Big Bang is saying they're going to reach a point of infinite gravity and density, that's a problem as well. So the two endpoints that humanity has come up with, although we can imagine them, they can't really exist the way they are defined. But there is room somewhere in between to find an avenue to establish justice for existence. So if you using God and your moral standard, you're using that as your guide to develop morals and codes and how we interact, then you can have an evolution from slaughtering each other and all that, all the way up to something new. And that's where we have your Christ figure. And this is going to be one of the points of contention, obviously. But everything is driven by consensus. We evaluate guitar solos, like top 10 guitar solos. You'll have the least and the best guitar solo, and then we all vote on it. We say, well, this is probably the worst, and this is the best. And we do that with everything. We do that with movies, books, everything we enjoy. We place in a spectrum. Singers, beauty. We say this person is more attractive than that, and then we'll have a top 10 most attractive women or men, and it's all based on consensus. And existence has been operating that same way through every recursion. It runs its own internal consensus on everything that it merges from the 0 and 1 from the initial first recursion. Everything is based on a sphere, a triangle. These are shapes that can be from the first recursion that get carried over into all other recursions because they're more valuable to existence. It's establishing a spectrum of value for everything that's created along the way. And it's placing them in this spectrum because it's kind of like the resume for existence. If resume was applying for a job, if existence was applying for a job somewhere, it would submit a resume. It says, well, I came up with sphere, I came up with triangle, I came up with matter, I came up with hydrogen, I came up with oxygen, I came up with life. And it would list all of these things in that resume because they're the best that existence produces. There's a lot of stuff out there that really doesn't really mean that much in existence, but it was necessary at some point to put it out there. So now we are at the forefront of existence. We are pretty much existence's last chance to establish justification for existence by taking everything that it imbues and forcing it into our minds and causing us to be considered like outside observers for everything that's going on. We are constructing inside our minds a moral template. And how far can that moral template in some way establish justification for existence? And existence is counting on it. It can't go anywhere beyond that, because if you're self-aware, that's you counting yourself as one. You are seeing yourself as one amongst all others. And we can recognize this. That's the beauty of self-awareness. So when we recognize ourselves as one, we are pretty much at the exact same point existence was at the very beginning. We're facing that same struggle. So now we have the Christ character that comes along, and he's bringing in a whole new moral template into the existence evolution. Instead of it being eye for an eye, now it's you should show forgiveness. There's a counter to all of the things that were logical and they don't make sense to our minds because we're used to processing logic. Now here, if somebody does something wrong with you, we have this individual saying, forgive them for it. And this is also a way that I include religion. A lot of theories, they don't want to include religion or anything like that. They just toss it out the window. But my argument is if it exists, then it's a puzzle piece. We have to address it. There's a reason why religion exists. And this is the reason. When you get self-awareness, when you get the knowledge of one, you get morality that comes along with it. You get a whole new arena, a whole new place in existence where information is being generated. It's all new information. And it's more important than any of the information before it. The construct of God, the entire mechanism that goes into thinking of what God is more valuable information than any of the information ever produced before. If you went back to the early universe when you had a quark gluon, trillion degree quark gluon soup, there's not much information going on there. You're not going to find any justification. But when you're starting to get into these constructs that are now emerging after 14 billion years of evolution, now you got something to work with. So we have this Christ character that establishes the highest level of moral code that we can comprehend. And now a lot of people argue, so we got Muhammad, you have other religious figures, but that's again where consensus comes in. I'm not just promoting Christianity anyway. I did research on this, and all the overwhelming majority of polls, if you were to say who is the most influential individual to emerge in humanity, they all point to Jesus. So he's in the number one spot, and then you work your way down, and there are some that will consensus that will point to someone else. But by and large, if you do your research, you will see that Jesus is considered the number one most influential person in human history. And the template he offers is something that's contrary to actually the religion that spawned him. He actually worked against the religion that he was a member of. And not only that, but he had Rome that was not too happy about him. So the guy has no allies. He's a complete isolated individual, and he ends up dying for his own cause. He is nailed to a cross. He is sacrificed, but he's willing to take all of that because he feels that his moral doctrine is worth his own non-existence. He's willing to trade his own non-existence or trade his own existence to non-existence in order to promote this because he believes in it, that it represents truth. It represents a justified version of existence. Now, existence recognizes this because we recognize it. We recognize that forgiveness it's a virtue. If you can forgive somebody for a wrongdoing, I mean, there are people that say no eye for an eye. Whatever they stole from you, steal back. You could still think that way. But there's something about the forgiveness part that kicks into us. It speaks to us. And if it's speaking to us, it's speaking to existence in the same way. Existence is taking this new information and adding it to its spectrum. I call it the omega spectrum. That's the best of everything. It's putting that at the top of the spectrum. But it cannot say that this represents justification for existence, that this new moral code is the highest standard. It can't say that because that would be circular reasoning. Existence is grounded in logic. When it started out as logic, it carried that logic all the way through. And logic says that you cannot state yourself as justified. It has to come from an outside reference point. That's why we exist. And that's where Jesus comes in with his moral standard and establishes justification for existence. He sacrifices himself. In other words, he gives up existence for the sake of others so that they can exist. But existence still needs something outside to demonstrate that actually represents justification for existence. So it waits. Then eventually humanity resets the world clock to year 1 BC and year 1 AD. That's us essentially establishing a new recursion. We're saying that all of the information before Jesus is outdated and we have a new template that we operate based on his moral code. So whereas existence has initiated all prior recursions, your first, second, third, and fourth, the fifth recursion has been initiated by its outside observers called humans. We have created the new recursion called the fifth recursion through our own moral code and through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So that is the highest point of existence. And I also argue that whatever represents the highest point of existence is what existence becomes. Because there's no sense in becoming anything less than the best. So if Jesus is demonstrating the highest level of morality, the highest echelon of conceivable information through his moral code, then that's what existence is going to operate by going forward. So once we establish that year 1 and AD at year 1 BC, we've created that dichotomy, that separation, and we've been expanding ever since then. We've increased in technology and all that. Existence is justified. It sees now that it is justified. It realizes that to get past the paradox of zero, you have to be able to accept it. You have to be able to sacrifice. Sacrifice gets you past zero. And with Jesus demonstrating that, it realizes now that it is justified thanks to us establishing that as outside observers. But we don't see it. We're still going on as normal because we were just tools. Humans are just tools, just like geometry was, just like mathematics, just like inanimate matter, just like animals killing each other. All of these things were just tools that existence employed to try to establish justification for being one step above non-existence. Now that it realizes that the thing that has brought justification for existence is now in jeopardy because we don't know. We're just going on as normal. Existence sees itself as justified, and now it sees us on a collision course with self annihilation. We're instead of expanding, we're breaking down structure into zeros and ones. We're fighting in society, politics. Your view is wrong, my view is right, and we both see it in opposite ways, and we end up in wars and destroying each. And the idea that we're able to split atoms and create weaponry that can destroy the earth, existence realizes that we're on a path of self-destruction. So now that existence has a dilemma, it's received justification. It knows now that to exist is justified. It doesn't have to do any more research. It doesn't have to explore any new information. It's already established that. It can just expand in that direction without any worries. But it also knows that we don't know that. And so it has to have its own moral dilemma. It has to decide, do I just let humanity go along? Or do I use the same moral code that Jesus has initiated and find a way to stop that from happening? And that's why I argue that this book comes into play. The book is existence communicating with humanity to let it know its story. It's saying, this is what happened. You have brought me to this position. You have brought existence to justification, but you don't realize it. So this is the sixth recursion. This is existence using the same binary structure, communicating through us into this book and explaining to us where we're at and that existence is justified and we have to follow the direction of existence. This is the direction that existence is going now. It's going that you must forgive people. You must be kind to people. You should not hurt people. You should not steal. You should not rob. You should not do all of the things that we see are bad. That's the direction that existence is going. And if we all got along on that same path, if we all grabbed the brass rings of the existence train and followed that path, then we would survive if we followed that moral code. So this book came out in 2021, so we're only 5 years into the sixth recursion. But that's the part where the book comes into play. It's existence saying you did a good job, you got the job done, but now you have to start moving in the right direction. Because if you're not moving in the same direction as existence, you get archived. Your information gets archived. If you're moving in the right direction, then your information gets included on the existence train. And we do that every day on our computers. We take images, files, and everything. Anything that we're not using anymore, we dump into the recycle bin. We throw it in there, and we do the same with artifacts in our houses. If we don't use them anymore, clothing, we box them up and put them away. We don't need that information anymore. We go with whatever the direction that we're moving in at our current time in life. And that's what existence is doing. And existence is telling you, if you do not follow this flight plan, you're going to get left behind. And that is the basis for zero theory. There you go.
Well, that's it's quite the introduction. Is very, very complete.
It's kind of hard to keep it all in logical order, but and I probably misstated a lot of things or made it confusing, but it's a process from start to finish with a goal. It has a goal. And a lot of people don't like the idea of existence having intent or some kind of goal. They find that a humanization of existence. It's throwing a human element into it that you don't necessarily have to have. But humans exist just like everything else. And in my theory, if it exists, I'm going to include it into the theory. But yeah, now existence is justified and we have to follow that flight plan.
Yeah, I think definitely, everything you've said so far is quite dense and a lot of details is very difficult to articulate. But contrary to speaking it, I think what you've written is extremely clear and articulate and focused, so I think it's much easier to follow the book right now, but in part, people don't read, and there is a lot of information that gets lost when you don't seize the opportunity to speak an idea, and render it tangible in that way. There's something about expression that carries more meaning somehow. So I think it's very good that you are practicing, and I think over time, the more that you do these interviews and podcasts and speaking engagements, you'll be able to articulate it more and more clearly. So that's a good thing. I can say, maybe to reiterate in a very, very reductionist manner, from what I understood, Zero theory is based on 5 laws and 6 recursions.
Yes.
These laws build upon each other in a recursive fashion. For those who don't understand recursion is in some way, it's just using what you have, as a model, and you copy it and evolve and build. So you kind of, and then, so that's the main functionality of it. And I think where people really should read that companion book is to try to understand what these recursions are, how they relate to each other, and how they evolve. And I think that you did brilliantly in the companion book, and it's very clearly laid out. I think where things get difficult is where they typically always get difficult philosophically, which is, like you said, at the very beginning and at the very end. So, how do you bootstrap from, for example, using the foundational substrate of information and then how do you get from that as an abstraction to something physical, different things like that. How do you reconcile consciousness with any of this? And so those are the weeds of it, which I think we should dive into. What do you think?
Well, right off the bat, I agree with you. One of the problems is how does existence count itself? I mean, but I'm arguing that logic and intelligence are synonymous. I'm postulating that intelligence has been present all along. We don't know where intelligence comes from. We don't. It's a paradox to say how do you get intelligence from non-intelligence? It's the same paradox as getting something from nothing or consciousness from non-consciousness. These are all things that a state change just doesn't make sense. So, but if you say that they're attached to everything from the start, I'm not saying they've been infinitely here. I don't like infinite regress. But if you say it's just part of the package you get with existence, then it does make sense. If you have a minimalistic form of intelligence, just a presence of intelligence, and the only capability this intelligence has is the ability to assess itself, to count itself as one. That is a minimalistic form of intelligence. It's not writing a Mozart opus, or it's not doing a Da Vinci painting. It's only enough intelligence to count itself and establish a presence. And then it can build upon that and then use that new information to count zero. So it's a philosophical position, but it's also grounded in logic. But you have to make some assumptions that intelligence has been present from the beginning, and there's a lot of people that will not go along with that. But if you accept this theory, then it works.
Yeah, I would have to push back on, and in a way, not push back. It's just kind of strange. The idea that one has to be able to count itself at the very first recursion. I think counting, it really only takes over the second recursion when duality comes into play. So the fact that it's able to count zero by contrasting itself with it is how it's able to count itself. That's the way I would perceive it. Because, and this is where I have some contentious points to throw your way, but it sounds like, well, not sounds like, I think from what I understood, logic and number, mathematics, are foundational in some fashion, that everything can be reduced to that as a substrate. And I think that it's a substrate that you can reduce to if you assume that we require a substrate in order to explain reality. I think the really difficult part is to explain how reality can emerge or not emerge, or how can we articulate reality by getting away from concepts such as causality, such as emergence, which really only happens in the second recursion. That's why I think like the value of what you're discussing happens more in the very first recursion. And it doesn't make sense to throw away that value in the second recursion. That second recursion is just part of the complexity that has emerged from the very first one. The very first one, the interaction between 0 and 1, that's the one that I think we need to really dig into a
All
little
right,
bit more.
well, let me add something to that. I understand what you're saying, but one thing that's missing in the first recursion that is present in the second is time. Now, when I have existence assessing itself and counting itself as one and then counting as zero, we see that as a before and after situation. But to speak to your point, the counting is a simultaneous act. In fact, all mathematics that ensues after that all happens within the same instant because there's no time in a non-dimensional realm. One plus one equals two is a self-contained factual statement. It doesn't see it as I take one and then I add another one to it, and then I end up with two. That is a timeline. You're taking something, adding something to it, and then getting an end result. Existence during the first recursion doesn't see it that way. It sees it as a mathematical truth. 1+1 = 2, and then it moves on to the next. And that all happens simultaneously. And I would argue it's similar to the way that Big Bang emerged from that zero singularity. It's everything emerging all at once. And that's also go ahead.
Sure. Sorry, I'll just interject here. This is the thing I wanted to point out at is still an assumption to say that that number, that truth exists. It's a very Platonic idea, which I'm okay with. What I want to push for is understanding how to justify that to begin with, right? Like, if like, to me, the idea that 1+1 = 2 as an abstract truth, how do you get from that to the manifestation of an actual reality where 1 causes, or 1+1 causes 2 as a matter of time and physics and all these other complexities? And I think, like, to me, the beauty in numbers, at the very least, is that you can that they show a relationship. That there's and relationship, as maybe you could call it a quality, is what becomes interesting to me, right? Because the relationship of 0+1, 1+1, is getting closer to trying to justify the whole system versus just saying, well, these are truths that we're going to assume. It's another assumption that I'm trying to, in my personal work anyway, that I want to get beyond. I don't want to have to smuggle number under the rug and then just say, yeah, well, that's the assumption. Because I still think that there's something very important with number and mathematics and its relevance to the justification, but I still think that it doesn't stand on its own 2 legs yet. And that's where I think using number is a good reference for understanding other abstractions, like if we use the word quantity, quality, truth, pervasiveness. I think qualities is what we're trying to arrive at, like conclusion, instead of foundation. Like, to me, the idea of there being a necessary substrate, I mean, the principle of sufficient reason does make sense on one of these levels, on one of these recursions. But I think that the intuition that I have is that at base, in the most fundamental way possible, in the deepest sense that we're trying to express and articulate reality, it wouldn't make sense that we would attach anything as being foundational. And what would make sense is to say that everything is relational. And so there is no precedence. There isn't one that causes another, or one that's more fundamental in some fashion. And yeah, I don't know if I'm expressing that well.
No,
but
I'm understanding what you're saying. Relationship and dichotomy, I think, go hand in hand. You have to offer contrast. If you don't have contrast, you don't have conceivability. So to me, conceivability is the driving force behind the relationships. It's the driving force behind the dichotomies. It's the only way to comprehend information. And to speak to existence counting itself as one, if I apply the principle of sufficient reason to it, there would have to be a sufficient reason for it to count itself as one. Now, Descartes postulated, and I think therefore I am, he's taking the most basic way he could possibly think of to assess that he exists. And if you're a minimalistic form of existence and that's all you are, is a presence, the only thing available to you is logic, because it is arguable that logic has always existed. You don't need humans to have logic. You don't need a universe for logic to exist. It could essentially exist on its own. But the principle of sufficient reason steps in when existence counts itself as one, because it has one of 2 alternatives. It's a presence, but it's an inconceivable presence because it hasn't established its relationship, its contrast, which is non-existent because that's not there. So it has a choice. It can either remain at the status quo and just be this self-contained form that's inconceivable, or it can break that barrier by counting itself and then counting what's not. So logic says if you can either be as you are, or you could advance and find something new. It's the desire to find newness, novelty, that compels it to count itself as one. So there is a reason for it to count itself as one. The only alternative is just to remain inconceivable.
Sure. I think that the snuck premise, though, is always like, so now we've switched from information, which is math, 1, 0, and number, to logic, which is law in a way, and in structure. So to me, it's just shifting the problem to another area in the sense that logic being fundamental or just being there, be beyond physics, is now the same foundation that we use to justify, but itself isn't justified either. I mean, shouldn't logic also justify itself to satisfy the law of satisfaction in the recursions? So, like, according to your book, the identity of existence is formed by conceivability, right, in the very first recursion. So the concept implies consciousness. So, and so then I would try to take away from you the ability to also move the problem into the third area, which is that consciousness would be that foundational substrate as well, that we don't need to justify. Do you see what I mean? There is an infinite regress that happens once you do remove foundational substrates. And I don't see an issue with that. That's where I would embrace the whole system as being open and unbounded. That infinite regress isn't necessarily a fault, it's a feature. So this is why it's interesting, because you, along with my friend who has something called data metalogical theory, he also uses or pairs information and logic as being like dovetailed together and the foundational structure upon which everything emerges.
I
And
would gravitate in that direction. Yeah.
yeah, so that's the similarity that I see in your theory as well. And I'm very I'm very fascinated by the way your theories tend to describe this system from the island of stability of having a foundation upon which you can move forward, right? And so I don't necessarily see myself as being contrarian to what you guys are saying, but actually complementary. It's just that I'm doing it from no platform other than, I wouldn't say I wouldn't do it without a platform. I'm just coming at it from the opposite side of the aisle, in which I invoke infinity and eternity as qualities that reconcile these substrates that you guys are trying to use as foundations, but just fall into infinite regress without explanation as well. And I would say that I explain that they're not necessarily like, you must use them as foundations, yes, to explain how physics emerges, for example. But in order to explain them, which is the real point to me in metaphysics, the real hard chestnut to crack is to understand, well, what is information? What is logic? How is that presence there? How does that exist? And I would say that, I know that that's moving into infinite regress, because you're saying, well, you're always going to have this other justification to justify. And to me, that's why it points to the direction, but you have to be clever not to follow in that direction. And what I mean by that is, infinite is the thing you have to focus on, not the regress. You forget the regress. That's right. Well, why do we need to justify logic? Why do we need to justify information and whatever else we're going to come up, like description, to justify those things? Infinitely so. That's not the problem. The real problem is to understand the nature of the infinite as a quality, and perhaps that there's an answer there that we can arrive at, that will explain how things don't necessarily have to be tied to causality. They don't have to be tied to emergence, although those things are interesting, and that we do need a way to try to understand how those things function in so far as trying to make the leap from the abstract soup, as it were, to a physical system. But even more foundational than that is where I want to get to. And that's why what's different about you is that you do clarify and accept and integrate the very necessary mechanism of using non-existence as a definitive verification for one to be able to count itself. So to me, people who just discard zero and say, well, it doesn't exist by definition, so let's just move on, to me is a very, I'm not trying to come at it from an antagonistic point of view, but it's a little bit lazy, and or cowardly. It's cowardly in a way, because there's a reason why from the beginning of human history we have discussed and debated whether something came from nothing and nothingness and zero. And to say simply, well, zero and nothingness doesn't exist by definition is just defaulting to putting language as the godhead upon which it justifies everything. It's like, well, no, language is not to me an adequate, what's the word I'm looking for, lens through which we can see everything. I mean, it really reduces the complexity and profundity of reality to a human faculty. I really doubt, inductively, I think you could say that the probability is very close to zero that language is foundational. I mean, it's foundational for how we experience concepts and everything, sure, but it's not foundational insofar as we're actually articulating reality as it is. And so, to me, logic, number, language, consciousness, we're always kind of discussing and fighting over which one is foundational and which one and how they fit together. And I don't see a need for that at all. I see that there's something intuitive that the human being has, and the intuition is that you can experience. And I think that's where, experience, if you absolutely have to have a foundational concept, experience is a good one because it acts as a nexus that connects all of these together. I mean, we experience nothingness or void when we think about it. And in our experience emerges the experience of a paradox. In our consciousness, I mean, the paradox is what is experienced when you think of void. The point is, it exists insofar as it is something that we wrestle with to try to define it, confine it, discard it. It doesn't really matter. It does exist on some level, and that's one thing that I really appreciate, at least, that you do that supports a little bit more the work that I do. But this is, well, I didn't want to get into my work. I just wanted to point out, the big elephant in the room that is not just one that occupies your room, but seems to occupy most people's rooms. I don't, even Grand Priest, who I did interview, who is a pretty, I'd say officially, he's a dialetheist, which means that he believes that contradictions can exist in a certain fashion. That's just a very quick way of saying that. But the point is, I don't think he accepts that the contradiction that I propose, which is that void can coexist with existence, and that void is ontological. That's a very, very nonsensical thing to most people's ears. And to me, the way that you've articulated the necessity for void or nothingness or zero is pretty much what I have in mind. It's necessary to treat zero as ontologically valid in order for one to be able to count itself through contrast.
All right. Well, if I could jump in there for a second, I understand
Sure.
exactly what you're saying. He argued that non-existence is inconceivable because conceivability requires something that's able to be conceived. If you're not offering any information, there's nothing for you to conceive. But we still have to deal with the state. If you have a state of existence, there has to be a counter reference point. That's what you get in the third law of existence. Existence cannot recognize itself without its counter condition, but its counter condition is technically non-existent. So you don't really have that frame of reference, but you know it's there. And the way we recognize nothingness is if we have 10 of something and we take 10 of something away, we don't have anything. So we recognize absence. The question comes, can you recognize absence of everything? And I don't think that's conceivable. And that's how existence exploits non-existence, by assigning zero to it, to give it a sense of conceivability so that it can work that dichotomic pairing into place, satisfy the third law of existence, and move on. I do not like infinite regress. That bothers me. It makes my brain hurt. I see everything that we observe as having an origin point. You have an origin point. I have an origin point. Earth, the sun, our galaxy. We see origin points all over the place. This interview has an origin point.
Yes, but the plane upon which origin points exists, does it have an origin point?
Well, that's kind of an abstract thing.
But that's what I'm saying. So I'm saying that infinite is part of it, but regress isn't a part of that. When I articulate it that way, I'm basically saying infinity is there, and infinity doesn't have an origin point. That's how it justifies all the finite aspects within it. And regress is what we need to forget about, because it's not actually relevant. Regress is only something that becomes relevant if you operate under dualism and time and all these different things that exist within the system, or the second recursion, as you would put it. And so that's why I don't see there being an incompatibility there. I think another distinction I would make is you're saying that void is inconceivable. I would say that first we need to distinguish between perception, whether it's perceivable or not. It's not perceivable, I would say. Conceptual, absolutely. I mean, there are plenty of things that we're able to conceive of that we don't have any kind of perceptual ability for, right? I can conceive of an alien named Bob who's living on a planet called Zoltan, and he's having coffee with the Queen. It's a concept that I have no perceptual. I'm attaching, prototypical or not. What's the word I'm looking for? I'm attaching a proxy perception to those concepts to build an emergent concept to attach to this thing that is inconceptual. And as far as I'm concerned, if I frame it that way, it's actually servicing your argument that it is inconceivable. So I could say that, yeah, and concede that it's inconceivable in the most logically rigorous of fashion. But intuition comes into play here, where there seems to be something that you can feel. That's part of the experiential part of consciousness. You can feel, you can intuit something that doesn't exist, and everything that exists somehow. That's what people do when they sing Kumbaya and dance, or smoke some weed, or make really good love, or see a beautiful sunset. They end up feeling existential, meaning they're connected to everything. It's almost as if though, for a fraction of a second, they felt like they were no longer the drop in the ocean, but the opposite, right? The ocean and the drop, and so that experience, which we call intuition, I would say, is there. It's presence, it's being, it exists. And so how can we discard something like void when we are capable of intuiting it? I mean, think about before you were born. It's absolute oblivion. And it's an experience in a paradoxical manner of speaking that you can have, thinking about your pre-conscious existence is just like void in a way. So I don't shy away from void, but I also think that the benefits in accepting that the void exists in some level, or at least treating it seriously, logically speaking, and giving it its rightful place in logic, can have a lot of benefits to reconcile a lot of these problems, like infinite regress, like trying to establish a foundation instead of seeing these things as relationships, and so on, right? And the last thing I want to say about that is, if I take a second to collect myself here, yes, the idea of an a priori truth. Why is it that we can accept many different kinds of a priori truths, which is how we establish a substrate without proof, right? Like logic or number. It's just so fundamental that there's no requirements to empirically prove it or justify it.
We can't prove it, but we know it's accurate.
Yes, we can't prove, but we know that it's true, right? In some fashion. Okay, so why is it that we can accept that for certain objects, like mathematics and logic, but we can't do it for other things like the infinite, the eternal, and the void? I mean, if you think about it, logically speaking, the void is more a priori than other. So it's kind of strange, because how can one thing be more a priori than another? In this special case, it seems to be true, because not only is it not required to have any empirical or conceptual proof of void, but void removes there being any kind of framework upon which it's relevant to have an a priori truth. That's how fundamentally a priori it is. That's how deep I think void transperces itself. It's a French word, transpercer. I don't know if that translates in English. It's so pervasive it goes through our bones. And I think that's what Carl Jung was discussing when he was talking about the pleroma in Jung's 7 Sermons to the Dead. Anyway, that's my bit that I wanted to put out there, just because, it's a nice capstone to everything you've sort of built this beautiful pillar, and I just want to cap it off with the ideas that I have that brought us together. Did you want to comment on what I've just said so far, and then we can move into the questions?
Yeah, I'll just make it quick, because I don't want to take up all your time on that one topic. But I have no problem with infinity as long as it's forward directional. I can't go infinite back in time because I cannot process that logically. whatever point along an infinite timeline of continuous existence, whatever point you would pick, there's infinitely more time previous to that than whatever time is after that point. There will always be more time before that point than there is after that point because it's infinitely existing. I think that's existence telling us that existence needs a starting point. Even the mathematics, the number system, you have positive and negative numbers, but they all converge at zero, which is neither positive or negative. I consider that a starting point, and you can branch your domains of infinity beyond those 2 points, but you still have to have that zero to set it all
Yeah.
off.
I would say, not to be pedantic, but I would say that those are points indeed, and they are required, but they're not necessarily starting points because those points exist everywhere within the spectrum. And in between those points, there's an infinite spectrum of points and so on ad infinitum, to me, the way I conceptualize it. So I'd have to get into a lot of my ideas to try to make sense of all that stuff. And that's a digression that I can't do here. But the point is, I think that everything that you're saying, I agree with from one side of the spectrum. When you say that it's not logically coherent and that there's the forward momentum in time, I still think that you're constraining yourself to the space-time construct. And that if you divorce yourself from the space-time construct and enter the realms of conscious experience and all these other abstractions that we wrestle with, that they don't all have to conform to the physics of the space-time construct, that they have to work for it. I think that they can exist on their own as perfectly sensible tools within the utility that we're seeking to explain reality without having to be tied down to space-time. They also conveniently explain space-time and its emergence and all these relationships too. At least I think they can. But I think that if we're going to finally crack that nut, we're going to have to divorce ourselves from space-time and stop looking at logic, information, consciousness, and all these other gateways that we're trying to, because it's the measurement problem, right? How do you measure a ruler with itself? Well, to get outside a system in order to measure the internal system, you have to first admit that there is an unbounded aspect within which the system exists. And if it's unbounded, then you're having to discard with the point of origin idea, at least in some fashion. I mean, points of origin can exist, and they do, but they also, but trying to understand the whole system as a whole, it doesn't make sense to have a point of origin, because then you're saying, well, how can I explain this? Having a point of origin when you're discussing the nature of reality is like trying to have a reference for something that you're pushing yourself into an infinite regress immediately, because that's where I think we're on the same side here. Is if you don't like infinite regress, I don't either, and I think the only answer is to stop using points of origin, because it's begging the question, where does that origin point come from? And that is the question, right? That's the holy grail, I think, of metaphysics, is to try to understand that. And I think that it's something you can understand if you really say, well, let's not use ourselves as a metric here. Let's use the intuitive experiences that we have, such as infinity and so on. But,
well, let me throw you a lifeline on that.
Sure.
I'm not a big fan of infinite regress. I don't think infinity can move backward. I think infinity is only a forward process. You have to establish something and then move forward. But I have existence counting itself at one point. Using that point word again. Technically speaking, existence has always been. It's always been there. It's just not been a conceivable form of existence. It's a state where there is no recognition that it actually exists. So it's tantamount to non-existence. It's representation of a void. If you're inconceivable, you are the void. So it's separating itself from what it perceives as what it is not by doing the counting. So I'm assigning that as a starting point, but technically speaking, existence and non-existence would have had to have been there all along. It's just unrecognizable.
Yes, I agree with that. And to me, I think the second recursion, which is duality, gives you this certain doorway into truth, which is the truth of symmetry by identity. So you say 0 by 1, and I say equally as valid is 1 by 0. See, the void is one thing itself as well. And so there's a symmetry of identity there that reflects each other. And if you say that, you can see that it works both ways, that 0 by 1 and 1 by 0, that right there is what discards the idea of points of origin. Because, and here's how I'll frame it as a question. In your timeline of infinity moving forward in only one direction, in the middle, are you capable of going backwards toward its origin point? So can you count back from 5 to 1? Because
Yes.
we're going in one direction, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but can you go count back to 1?
My argument is that all information that's generated from that first initial counting is always available. No information is ever lost because
Okay.
existence never
So
gives up any information to the set of non-existence.
So I'm trying to put you in the trick bag here because you did say you can't, that infinity doesn't go run backwards, but it runs backwards at least within itself. And the real question I think would be, and this one would be harder to try to trick you into, is does it go backwards from 1 to 0? So you can go backwards from a billion to finally get to 1, but does it go from 1 to 0 is the real question. And I'm saying that it can, because if you can go from 0 to 1, you can go from 1 to 0. I don't see, logically speaking, there's no logic that says that can't happen. I mean,
well, no, I'm going to agree with you that you can go the whole way, all the way back down to 0. And let me clarify something. 0 by 1, that's not really the structure I'm promoting. The book is titled 0 and the author is 1. So when I say by 1, it's like by the author, and the author just happens to be 1. 1 doesn't know anything else about itself other than it is 1 of something. So it kind of misconstrues the theory, but it looks really cool as a book cover, and it looks really good on people's shelves. So I went that direction. But you can go back to 0, and that's due to the fifth law of existence. I've got that in there. Existence requires justification. If it cannot justify being one number above 0, then it returns to 0. It returns to its inconceivable state. That's why it keeps pushing forward. It's not and that's where time enters in under the second recursion. Existence sets a timeline. It's saying that this is not an indefinite period where I just try to find a justification. This is on a clock, and that's where your time and your precursors for time are encoded in mathematics when you have 1 plus 1 equals 2. That's your precursors for time, because there's things that must happen before you get your sum. And then that translates into time. What I don't have, and obviously I don't, is how to get from the first recursion to the second recursion. I don't have a viable way to get from non-physical information to physical information. It's like a little magic here and then you get it. The closest thing I've come is if you agree with Big Bang and then you're crushing physical matter down into a singularity, you can either accept that it just keeps going infinitely dense and infinitely gravitized, or there's a state change from physical to non-physical when you reach a certain degree of gravitational influence. That's the best I've got. I'm not a physicist. I leave that door open for the people who know more about what they're doing. They might be able to take what I'm proposing in this theory, use that as a basis to come up with some other model. I don't know.
I do think that at the very least, having gotten to 5 levels of recursion to get to a stability to justify existence, I think you've succeeded in that pretty well. I think the justification part is where we're still like kind of wrestling, because does stability imply cessation? I mean, is there not a 6th and a 7th recursion ad infinitum? That's one question I would have. Another would be, how, well, I would have to, it's not clear in my mind enough yet because it's been a while since I read the book, but the justification principle, and maybe I can read it into my notes here. The justification is another thing that I want to, okay, I say this, actually it's an admiration comment. The same undefined filament, I have a lot. I have some questions. I have a few points of contention, and then I have some admiration. The same undefined filament that ran through all prior recursions, the unresolved tension between 1 and 0 still persists, but it no longer serves the same purpose. Before justification, that filament represented the driving paradox existence was attempting to resolve. After justification, the paradox of zero has already been overcome at the highest level of value. The filament remains, but it now functions differently. It becomes the dividing line between what aligns with justified existence and what does not. This
Correct.
makes the omega recursion a recursion of separation as much as of one of preservation. And that was page 35 in your companion book. And I was like, wow, beautiful paradox. It's a wonderful, beautiful paradox. And the reason is because I think that you believe that the paradox is resolved at justification. And I'm thinking that justification is what's pointing to paradox, the paradoxical nature. And that's something we should get into as well. I don't want this to turn too much into, I've spent maybe 20 minutes explaining my point of view, but only as a ground upon which I can move forward with the questions that I have, because I'm coming from those places. I do have some questions that I think most people would ask as well. And I think that the two share the same aspect here. That I think my question and everybody else's question would be, how is this justification really justified at the end of the day?
Okay. With you have to get over non-existence. That's what existence has to get over. Existence knows that it exists because it counted itself as one, but it's also has knowledge now of non-existence through zero. So it wants to know, why do I exist? Why am I not like zero? Why does zero non-exist? What is it about me that's special that I should be above a level of nothingness? So it's a self-interpolation of justification. It's trying to think of a reason. I mean, each one of us thinks, I'm sure that you've thought of, wonder, why do I exist? Why do I exist at this particular time in the evolution of the universe? Why is it I appear? Why am I this way? And I think that's just a reflection of that same archetypal dichotomy that happened between zero and one.
So,
And
but can I,
get one,
sorry, just can I put
ahead.
your let me put your feet to the fire, because this is the crux of it. You're saying that, yes, I am higher than zero. But why is that?
Well, the argument is, if you look into between the lines of zero and one, existence is all that there is. There is no non-existence. The fact that existence counts whatever is available as one. The presence is counted as one. The non-presence is counted as zero. It's saying that there's nothing there to count. So that only leaves existence. It's a sideways way of saying all there is existence, but you still have to have that counter reference point in order to understand it.
Yeah,
So,
so that's what I'm saying. It's a paradox, because it requires the creation of nothingness in order to be able to justify itself. So you can't say that void exists, and you can't say that it doesn't exist. It's a stalemate. That's why I'm saying that it's better to actually state that void coexists with existence, versus saying that one precedes the other, or one is higher in a hierarchy than the other. That's where I'm coming from, right?
all right, but I would argue that you have to count one before you count zero in this scenario.
I don't think that's mutually exclusive. I think that's probably true. But I'm saying that by virtue of counting one through the contrast of zero, you've given zero an ontological validity.
All right, but what it's counting is nothing. It's assigning zero as conceptual. You can conceive zero, because if you take 10 of something away and that already exists, had to exist first. You had to have 10 of something and then remove it before you comprehend zero. So we can do that. If existence said, if I took away the oneness of me, what would be left? And it would be zero. That's the only way you can know that is by assigning zero to non-existence. But it can't count non-existence because there's nothing there to count. So it is a paradox. I will concede to you here on your podcast that non-existence is a relevant form. It is it's something that we know, but we can't conceive.
Yeah, I think
We can
and that's
conceive
why
something inconceivable in that respect.
this is why my philosophy is called paradoxism. I think that if we're going to try to understand existence, we have to embrace paradox. We can't use logic for the very, and I guess I will admit this is the weak point in my theory, that I'm using it I'm making an inductive argument. insofar as I believe the probability of human logic as being, the right lens through which we can actually justify existence is very low. I mean, we're horrible at logic. We're not very good with logic, and we've proven this time and time again. The example I like to come up with is that at some point in time we paired logic with empirical proof. It's just clean that the earth was flat. I mean, you know, everything that we saw was flat, and then people said, well, if the earth was round and spherical, what would happen to the people at the bottom? They
They
would
fall
fall
off.
off.
Yeah.
And that's using gravity, which is another empirical thing that we had at our disposal, until some new paradigm came to shift the reality. And then it showed us that, in fact, our logic and empirical faculties are nowhere near close enough to being able to measure the nature of existence or reality. And so that's where I like to try to say that we need to make a distinction here. We're not necessarily looking for truth. I think what we're looking for is reality. What is real versus what is true are two different things. And I think that the paradox at the bottom of this idea of 0 and 1 is an experience that is real. And that's, to me, is, I think, much more important if we're trying to understand our place in reality, if that's the goal. If you're trying to understand how physics emerges, then that's a different story. And yeah, you probably do have to chain yourself to logic. But I think that the work of metaphysics is to bring meaning and sense to existence itself, and by extension, ours. And the best way to do that is to embrace paradox, because ironically, and this is part of my work, I think that when you start to dive into logic enough, you start to realize that logic itself is paradoxical. And that would be something that we can prove through the tetralemma, Nagarjuna's tetralemma. But the point is, logic is paradoxical. And again, because there's a feature of reality that seems to be a symmetry of identity at play. Therefore, if logic is paradoxical, we can say that paradox is logical. It's logical to embrace paradox, because that seems to be the delineation between our weak logical faculties and our strong intuitive capability to sense what reality is and what is real and what is not real. And it seems to me that everything that we're looking at points to the fact that everything is real. It seems that there's no such thing as there being not real. That's where I'm shifting, and I would agree with people. I would say the void is real, but there being something that isn't real, that's not possible. That's not real.
Well, it's real as a conception. The fact that
Yeah.
we could speak of it, use language to describe it, means that it has some kind of importance in regard to existence. I had a point I was thinking of. If on logic, if you were to apply my theory all the way down, it would be logical. I know it could be circular. I'm using logic to conclude that a logic origin point for existence would be more sensible than anything abstract or anything that involved creative, because you have to start out as something rudimentary, and logic seems more rudimentary than abstract concepts and like constructs like God. That's not a logical construct. And it's what you find at the end of the fifth recursion is existence accepting a non-logical solution to enact justification for existence. Eye for eye is logical. Forgiving somebody who wrongs you is not logical. You're not getting
Paradoxical.
something. Yeah, it's not getting you. You're not getting back what was taken from you. There's no balance. And the universe is steeped in balance. You've got your third laws of motion. You've got the thermodynamics. It wants to be balanced. So when you take logic and you destroy it, you find new information, and that new information is what allowed justification for existence. So
Yeah,
yeah, it could
that's
start
why
out logic, but it doesn't have to end that way.
that's exactly why I think you're absolutely right with the Christ figure as being such an impactful consensus on the world, that, logic finds its own balance through paradox. And that's what I would call infinite regress of infinite regress squared, that there's always some like new way to, like, well, I guess it's recursion is infinite. And that's why I think that we can't get away from the nature of the infinite, and that the quality that we can attribute to the infinite is the eternal. More stuff that I'd have to go on about, but maybe because I invoked it already, I should say that the eternal is the the aspect of pervasiveness, no point of origin. It's you cannot define it. It is absolute. All these different qualities, and then the infinity is the the spatial temporal constructs, matter, dimensions, things, just concepts, the finitude. And the reason why they're so intimately connected is because, and I like to say it this way, we are in the finite. That's what the infinite is, meaning that everything is relational to everything else, and that is eternal. So the seam between infinity and eternal, the fact that infinity as a spectrum or as a line is never ending, is because it's reflecting the nature of the eternal, which is never ending. So there's an intimate connection between infinity and eternity in that way. And I think that can couch a lot of the work that you do, for example, into something that is like absolute. There's no debating it. There's no getting away from it in a logical way. It becomes absolute. It becomes an understanding that we can really have to really reach this consensus that, hey, we've finally put all these different elements together. And that's why I think that one of the ways to do that is to accept the Agrippin trilemma as being a trifecta, right? I'm not sure if you know about the Agrippin trilemma, but
Now I remember that from your previous video.
yeah, that you run into when trying to define existence on some level, you run into these three problems. Sozusagen, we say in German, so to say. It's actually also called the Münchhausen trilemma, so it's has a German title, ironically. But the infinite regress, an arbitrary starting point, which is another problem that I'm pointing out in your theory there. And what was the other one? Infinite regress, an arbitrary starting point, and
Well, I'll come back to the arbitrary starting point when you find what you're going to
yeah,
say.
it's infinite regress and an arbitrary starting point and circular reasoning. So I think that reality is circular, and I mean there's a relationship. Reality has a relationship with itself, is really what I would say. So there's circularity there. Infinite regress, yes, infinity goes on forever. So you go forward or backwards, you're going to have regress or progress. That's just a feature of the space-time and the physics within which we inhabit. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just the way it is. And then I don't know why I always forget circular reasoning, arbitrary starting point. Oh yeah, so an arbitrary starting point is like a subset problem of infinite regress, right? You can start anywhere, but how are you going to justify that that's the start? Well, you can't, precisely because there is no such thing as there being a start or an end on the grandest scale of what reality is. I mean, it's an unbounded field. You can be anywhere on that field and call it the origin starting point with perfect validity, but you won't justify it that way. So I think it's a trifecta, is my point.
All right. Well, I will go to my grave not being able to comprehend infinite existence moving backward. I can only move forward. It's something that I'll have to. I'm not saying that I won't come to terms with that, but I'm saying that I don't really posit a arbitrary starting point because I'm working in a domain where there's no time. If there's no time in this non-dimensional domain, then it's just a case of either or. Either existence stays the way it is or it makes a change. So it's not sitting around thinking, okay, am I going to count myself today or am I going to count myself tomorrow? It's just an automatic function, the fact that the two status exist. So it's
But
not an arbitrary, it's a necessary starting.
if you're outside of time, then how can you say it's going forward in any fashion?
Because there's new information being produced. The minute it counts itself as one, that's a piece of information. And if it can count non-existence as zero, that's another piece of information. Then it can use those two pieces of information to build more information. So it didn't have that information before. It needed a starting point.
Can information be lost?
No. Once information is generated, it's there forever. That's existence. Because really what the book is saying is existence is all there is. It's using its counter reference point. It's creating it to establish conceivability for itself. And we went over that. But it's using that to generate a starting point.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's where I appreciate it. I think you're taking zero and void seriously and incorporating it, which is a step in the right direction for me. And I appreciate it. I think that I still think that we don't necessarily conflict. It seems to be, a friend of mine said this. He said that from your point of view, there's a conflict. And from my point of view, I would say there is a conflict and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way it is. It's kind of a strange thing where I think that, to me, the, the, the fact that going backwards is not possible, I just don't think it's relevant. I mean, it's relevant only within existence. But when you're talking about existence as a discrete thing that's counted as one on its own, floating there in the void, you require void, and the moment that you use void, you're discarding with any concept like forward, backward, future, past, up, down. These things are just not relevant at that point, right? Those are relevant to the existential side of things, and existence justifies itself through its own absence, is the main paradox that I think everything could really be boiled down to from my point of view. And I don't see an error or a problem with that one. But I have to say that, I didn't want this to turn into a debate. I think that this is just a really good place to come to an end, because then we can really dig into, I like to get that out of the way. And so there's a frame of reference then when I have certain questions. And I think it would be nice to have you on again to do another chat where I can dive into some of the content that you've written. So a lot of these questions that I have here, and some points of admiration as well, if that's something
Well,
you're willing to.
well, I want the admiration part. I do want to concede, though, that your understanding of infinity in both directions, at the point before existence counts itself, it's still there. It's just in an inconceivable state. And I'm not saying there's any time involved. So if there's no time involved, you do have infinity. It could just as well apply as just saying there's no time. So I'm allowing existence to always be. It is only at the point of recognition that the starting point becomes conceivable. So I'm conceding to you a proto form of infinite regress, I guess, infinity existence on that side. It's just there's no time to chronicle it.
Yeah, yeah, that's all I'm saying. It becomes a quality versus a quantity. It's that's why I would say that there's no issue here. I agree that infinite regress is not possible. It stops from the existential side, and on the other side, regress is just not relevant because there's nothing there for regress to exist. Right? That's the interesting part of the void. It has to be infinite in nature. If you can give it a quality, you can't say there's like void and then it stops somewhere or at some time. It would be infinite or eternal in nature. It's just, and the interesting thing is it's not around. So it's like, it has the quality of the absolutes that goes beyond any other absolutes. I think that the void being absolute is in a way how existence justifies itself as being absolute, because there's no differentiation at base between void and existence. I'm saying that there's truly a unification there. It's pervasive.
All right. Well, let me add one last thing here, and then it's a short thing, but the fifth law of existence, that was present from the moment it counted itself all the way up to the end of it. And when you said, can information be lost? Can you go back down to zero? You're kind of arguing that you can't. And I'm saying that existence is on a timeline. It's not an infinite thing that it can keep on going without justification. It has to establish at some point. And the threshold was when it put self-awareness into humans. It put its own essence into us. That's your Hail Mary. You don't have anywhere to go after that. If you take what you are and put it into somebody and hope that it can resolve a situation, if they don't do it, what else can you do? So I'm saying that you can go back from 1 to 0. It would just be existence and non-existence in an inconceivable state because it can't justify any other state than. So that would be an infinite
I agree with
state.
That to me is what I agree with. The way you've conceptualized it there is what I'm trying to articulate as well.
All right, now, and one thing, if it ever did return to that state, you've got infinity all across the board because there's no reason to change. It already tried it once. If there's no sense of counting itself again, it's just going to get the same result.
Interesting. That opens up a lot of interesting doors. It brings to mind, I don't know, Hindu philosophy for me for some reason. But so the implications of what you're talking about is something I think we should discuss next time. Let's get into some of the questions that I had next time, the more like technical stuff. And then we can talk about the implications on multiple levels of analysis. Like, yeah, like what would happen if, or what does that mean for morality? Things like that. I really think that we can have a really great discussion. I'm glad we got the points of contention out of the way and we kind of know where we both sit. And yeah, I think interviews are always more fun when there's like some injecting of the not antagonism but of pushback.
I call it contrast.
Yeah,
Contrast
contrast.
brings forth reality.
Yeah. Darryl, I'm going to end with asking you if there's anything you would want to people to walk away with. After everything that you've said here today and what we've discussed, is there anything you want people to walk away with?
Well, there would be the first thing I would want is the predictability that the book provides for you. And you could argue that this necessarily comes from the book and it could come from other sources. But if you have a closed spectrum, like I'm trying to think, like, well, black and white is not because you have all the colors in between, but like quark and antiquark, we don't have a middle quark, or matter and antimatter. That's telling you that you can't evolve that spectrum anywhere more. And you could see spectrums that were attempted to be broken open here in modern society. And this is probably dangerous territory, but the gender ID, where somebody can say, well, I can be a man or I can be a woman. Once you do that, you don't have any distinction between man and woman. They're trying to insert a third spectrum member into a 2-point spectrum that cannot get in there. And if you follow the premise of the book, you would see that in advance that you would not be able to do that. There's nothing you can put in between. You can only do that with spectrums that allow for dynamic inclusion. And the second thing I would say is that going back to 1 and 0, existence at this point now is taking all of the things of value and placing them under the category of 1, and all the things that are of no value under the category 0. It's putting all of the information it is not into the void. It's saying, that's not me anymore. That's not what I am. I am this. This is what I am, and this is what you should be if you want to ride the existence train. So that's what I would want people to walk away with. That's that last chart in my companion that has the information on the top and the bottom, all the good information. You have the straight red line below it.
I'm going to say something, and this isn't to have the last word, but just have to. See, when you say I am existence, void is not me anymore, it implies that it was at some point in time. But when you realize that space and time is something only of the domain of existence, do you see what I mean? Do you see what I'm saying? That there's something important there, or maybe it's just a trick of language and I'm being cheap, but but you know what I mean? Like
Well, I think we
what
have
do
the
you mean
similar
when you say
language.
but what do you mean when you say that's not me anymore? Does that mean void existed at some point?
Well, like eye for an eye was a part of existence at one time. It's not a part of it anymore. It's been supplanted by show the other cheek. So there's a new piece of information that replaces it. It takes that information and archives it, just like we throw things in a recycle bin. It's still in your recycle bin, and you can go back and get it if you want, but you never access it anymore. It's not important to you anymore.
Yeah.
So that's the reference I'm using.
But in the context of void, because you said, I am existence and void isn't me anymore. What does that mean? Does that mean that void was before existence at some
It was a
point in
part of
space and time?
contention. It was the only way it
Or an
could
option?
understand itself was through the void. It needed the void to comprehend the void to comprehend itself. So it's a part of it in that way. It's like this piece of luggage that it has to carry with it and it has to always deal with it. And now it no longer has to deal with it. It can just shove a bunch of shit into it and put it off to the side. That's
So maybe
not very
me as a
philosophical way to put it.
no, I like it, but I think it's a good poetic way of saying that me as a being having, being created in the third recursion, I'm stuck with the artifact of, because, like you said, information carries through all the way to the last recursion. There's nothing lost. Well, for me, I don't know, there's nothing lost there. The void didn't go away. Maybe I'm not programmed well enough. I don't know. But
Well, the fact that you're talking about the void, it's still there. And I'm talking about it in existence. It's something that's not there, but we discuss it. And for existence, it's not there. It's the information that doesn't get discussed. That
Yeah.
represents the void. Just like zero represented at the beginning, slaughtering your neighbor is zero now. It all
Yeah.
falls under the heading of zero. So
So here's how I would say we could handshake deal this thing. I would say the void does and does not exist. And it's just a state of paradox.
I
It's
will
just
accept
there.
that paradox. I with here's the handshake. How do we do that? All right.
Very great. I gotta say, Darryl, this has been wonderful. It's just a blast talking to you. I really appreciate your work, both as a philosopher and as an artist. If anybody is interested in Darryl's work, I'll put a link in the description for your websites and a place to buy your book and get the PDF for the companion and all that stuff. Thank you so much for your time and for everything. And I'm really looking forward for the next time we come together to discuss the implications, like you brought up gender. I think that'll be fascinating conversations.
All right. And I sincerely thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking your time to give me a platform to speak about my theory. Because I'll tell you what, I have run into nothing but opposition in every realm. Unless you're a PhD wielding academiatron, nobody wants to give you any recognition. And the argument I have is there's 8 billion people on this planet that are coming up with amazing things that don't have PhDs. You're going to be missing them if you don't give them a platform. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity, and I appreciate you for granting me that opportunity. And I'd love to do another interview.
Thanks a lot, Darryl. We'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you very much. See you, James.
See ya.